O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Until a few weeks ago, I thought casting out unclean spirits was a bit anachronistic, something relegated to the distant past, back in a time long, long ago when people had trouble believing facts and science. Those poor early Christians, I thought to myself, they wrote a gospel that actually portrayed people as being captivated by some demonic force that caused them to do bad things. If only they knew what we now know about the psyche and serotonin and trauma and mindfulness, they could leave behind all this talk of unclean spirits. If those ancient, ignorant Christians had only known what we now know, they would have been freed from their own ignorance and could have really dealt with these problems on a scientific level like we have. Who knew that freeing people from the demons that contort their ability to know truth from fiction, up from down, right from wrong, would be so relevant at a time when we still can't get half a political party, much less some of the millions of their followers, to agree to play by the rules, to see the difference between protests that demand equal justice for all and those that use violence to try to take away the rights of some. Jesus, teach us, please, how to get rid of unclean spirits. Teach us, since none of our technology or knowledge or learning or wisdom seems to have been effective. Teach us how to rid each other of those unclean spirits that twist our intellect, our will, our spirit, and our conscience, allowing evil to be done in the name of good. But Mark isn't really offering a DIY lesson on exorcisms. There's no discussion of the anatomy of demons or the magic of incantations. We don't get a step-by-step guide to exorcisms complete with spells and charms. This isn't a Harry Potter film. And it's actually quite surprising that there's not more magical stuff in Mark's gospel, given the worldview in which it was written. Magicians and healers were all over the place. The world assumed their presence and power. I mean, the most objective historians of the time, Herodotus and Josephus, regularly explained historical events in the works they wrote as having supernatural causes. The fact that Mark's story about this man with an unclean spirit has supernatural assumptions built into it isn't surprising. What is surprising is that supernaturalism is not at all what Mark cares about. It's what we care about in our own time, since supernaturalism is not at all a part of our worldview. It's why my Bible titled this story, The Man with an Unclean Spirit. But if the original Greek manuscripts had actually included titles, they don't. I suspect Mark would have titled it something like Jesus' Confrontation with the Dominant Orders of Oppression. Now that would be a more descriptive title and a way more threatening one at that. Jesus is challenging those symbolic spaces of power where official authorities do their governing. He's challenging the powers that undergird the dominant social orders of his day. Jesus walks into a religious institution and acts in complete freedom with permission from no one but himself. It's a confrontational act. That's what the text is most interested in, not Jesus the magician, but Jesus wielding authority outside of the establishment. That's why he gets such a reaction, which is way more threatening than some story about Jesus bringing healing to someone suffering from a mental illness that wasn't understood as such in the first century. We can't domesticate it by medicalizing the event, simplifying the encounter as a case of a pre-modern physician bringing healing to a man who we've now found a way to fit into the DSM codes of our day. We have to face the claim from our Bibles that demonic forces, that is, power organized with a purpose in opposition to God's way, has found its way into all the spaces of authorized power, religious, political, social power. And Jesus begins his ministry by confronting that reality, confronting those forces in our world that keep the rich rich, the poor poor, despite everyone I know who says they want that reality to change. Jesus confronts it, which means he confronts everything about the way the world is ordered. It's like Jesus is saying to us all right from the beginning of his ministry, are you ready to join me in attacking all those systems that continue to separate human being from human being at every level of our world, at every level of your life? Are you ready to join me in freeing people from the lies they have believed and the myths they have trusted? That is what this ministry is all about. Are you ready for it? I'd like to say personally, my answer to that question this morning is no, I'm not ready for it. And look, this isn't a rhetorical trick to make the sermon more interesting. It's just the reality of all the stuff that I feel like I'm drowning in during COVID, which is also a reflection of what I'm hearing from so many of you. Jesus, I have my hands full at the moment right now with this little thing called a global pandemic, a few personal issues, and just some general tiredness from being on screens each and every blasted day. It is not a good time for confrontations with powers and principalities. I can't deal with frontal assaults on capitalistic systems of inequality and religious forces using their power against aliens, widows, orphans, and other people that our tradition compels us to defend, while I'm barely able to get to the grocery store before 6 inches of snow shuts the town down. I mean, can we take down racism and rectify colonialism and replace capitalism in the fall after we're all inoculated? When we have a little more capacity to deal with these big questions of forces organized against God's way? It was disappointing to see that the answer to that question, the timing question, is no. We don't get to wait. Jesus doesn't get to wait. Jesus doesn't get to choose when to deal with organized opposition to God's way any more than you or I. He's just minding his own business on a Sabbath day, going to services in the local shul, when bam, he runs right into unclean spirit number one. That's life with these kinds of demons. They're everywhere. You can't go to the grocery store or church or the comment section, the newspaper online, or your Instagram feed without running into them, without running into somebody speaking crazy stuff about Bill Gates and Dr. Fauci creating coronavirus to rule the world, or satanic Democrats managing pedophilia rings, or the more common kinds of demonic stuff that we've lived with for so long that it often slips by polite company without anyone naming it, as twisted as it is. You know, comments about Black people unable to get out of poverty because of the deficiencies in their culture, or Jews trying to control the world with their money, or Latinos crossing the border because those Latinos just love lawlessness. Jesus doesn't get to choose when he's going to run into those demons that rob people of their common sense and their common humanity without them ever even knowing they are sick until they get better. But while we don't get to choose when those confrontations occur, confrontations that we initiate when we see those demons in others, or confrontations others sometimes initiate when They see those demons in us. It was encouraging to realize that Jesus takes on these gigantic forces in very local and very human ways. I mean, he engages a man overcome by a spirit that is twisting his humanity. He engages him, frees him, claims him, loves him. He doesn't figure out how to bring equality to every single person in that moment. He hasn't developed a complete strategy to rid all people of demonic forces that capture us all at some points in times. He doesn't launch into a 20-point plan for resetting religious leadership in his day. He just heals a man he encounters on his way to services. It makes me wonder if sometimes in trying to get it all right, sometimes we take on too much. And in taking on too much, we realize how deficient we are in our efforts, which discourages us from taking on anything at all. The very cycle that leads religious and political leaders toward the status quo in the first place. Maybe a lesson from Jesus here is to grow, not always in the volume of the injustice that we seek to oppose, but in the quality and the focus of our living. If Jesus is challenging the forces that dehumanize life, that robs people of their humanity, that turns powers for good into powers that defend the status quo, he is careful not to fall prey to the same dehumanizing cycle himself. Jesus is careful not to take on too much. Think about it. His first action before he does anything is to call people together to form a team. And when too much does overtake him, he stops it. The Gospel of Mark is like one big cycle of Jesus confronting and healing in public spaces, then retreating to someone's house to eat, and then finally going to a deserted place to pray. Action, retreat, reflection, action, retreat, reflection. Yet if Jesus was walking the earth today, I guarantee you someone would be like, where is Jesus? I texted him like 20 minutes ago and I still haven't heard back from him. Jesus takes care of himself. And not because he's read up on the latest mental health research or studied the best meditation practices. No, he readies himself for these confrontations because he knows that the real purpose of these encounters isn't to win. The victory of God's way in the world is already established. You can see it right here in the story. The unclean spirits, they already know who Jesus is long before anyone else does. The forces opposed to God's way are already shaking in their boots. As one scholar describes Jesus' confrontation with this spirit, there is no struggle. From the very first, Jesus stands before a defeated enemy. I think Dr. King was right. The moral arc of the universe does bend toward justice. Racism has already been exposed as bankrupt. Economic systems that leave some with ungodly amounts of money while others beg at our stoplights. Those forces that are turning our markets into a gambling system, it's already been exposed as completely unworkable. Violence never delivers on its promises for the earth or for its people. We can already see that right now. We don't have to worry about holding the future completely in our hands. The purpose of these confrontations isn't to replace one kind of anxious human attempts at control with another kind of anxious human attempts at control. The purpose of these confrontations is to offer the world a different witness, alternative possibilities for living together in the world, a new world to live in when things do fall apart. And if you want to be able to offer an alternative possibility, you've got to try living alternative possibilities, however imperfectly, however inconsistently, right now. Jesus calls us. And sometimes I feel like we respond as if he's called us to clean the house or take out the trash or whatever chore you hate the most, when he's actually really calling us into an adventure to live possibilities the world has denied us, to confront those powers that govern our lives, not out of guilt or shame or worry about the future, but because our liberation is actually at hand. You don't have to wait until the end of a pandemic to start trying on those possibilities, alternative possibilities for how you live in relationship with the earth, alternative possibilities for how you engage with people in the grocery store, how you engage that family member whose politics you despise, how you engage your neighbors while removing snow this afternoon or tomorrow morning, alternative possibilities for how you listen before you judge, alternative possibilities for the qualities of the encounters that you have with people who seem possessed by powers that overtake them, alternative possibilities that can grow into the choices of where you live and how you eat and how you love and fight and live. Action, retreat, reflection. Action, retreat, reflection. That is the journey that Jesus confronts us with this morning. And while that confrontation isn't likely to change the world all at once, it just could be the one that changes yours. Amen.